Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. We've talked about where data gets cached in a system, but that brings up a crucial question: how do we make sure the data in our cache stays consistent with the data in our main database? If the data gets out of sync, our users could see old or incorrect information. Today, we're diving into the top 5 caching strategies, the common ways we keep our cache and database in sync. Understanding these is vital for building reliable and performant applications. Let's start with red strategies. How do we handle getting data when a user requests it? Cache aside, this is a very common strategy. How it works: when your application needs data, it first checks the cache. If the data is not in the cache, a cache miss, the application then reads from the database. Once it gets the data from the database, the application updates the cache with that data before returning it to the user. Pros: the update logic is handled by the application, making it relatively easy to implement. The cache also only stores the data the application actually requests, keeping it lean. Read-through: this strategy puts more responsibility on the cache layer itself. How it works: the application simply requests data from the cache. If the data is not in the cache, a cache miss, the cache itself is responsible for reading the data from the database. Once the cache retrieves the data, it stores it and then returns it to the application. Pros: the application logic is simpler, it just talks to the cache. This can also make it easier to scale the reads, as the cache layer handles fetching from the DB. Now, let's look at write strategies. How do we handle saving or updating data? Write around: this strategy prioritizes writing directly to the database. How it works: when the application needs to write data, it writes directly to the database. It does not write to the cache immediately. If the data was in the cache, it's typically invalidated or removed. Pros: the database is always the source of truth, as writes go there first. Write back: this strategy prioritizes fast writes by writing to the cache first. How it works: when the application writes data, it writes constantly to the cache. The cache acknowledges the write immediately, making the write operation very fast from the application's perspective. The cache then writes the data to the database once in a while in the background, asynchronously. Pros: provides lower write latency and often lower read latency for recently written data. The cache and DB are eventually consistent. Cons: the biggest risk is data loss if the cache goes down before the data is written to the database. Infrequently accessed data might also stay in the cache longer than needed. Write-through: this strategy ensures the cache and database are always in sync on writes. How it works: when the application writes data, it writes to the cache. The cache then writes to the database immediately and waits for the database write to confirm before acknowledging the write back to the application. Pros: reads have lower latency, data is in cache, and the cache and DB are always in sync after a write operation completes. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.